Now we are going to start a panel discussion with 4 experts from the Middle East. And this session will be moderated by the chair of the Academy of International Business, Dr. Robert Gross. May I request Dr. Robert Gross to come to the to come and take his seat here. And I would like to thank him especially because he left his house 3 o'clock this morning, took 2 flights, and then he came here on time. So thank you very much. We have a distinguished panel of 4 experts from the Middle East, and you must be wondering how we could get all these experts from Lebanon, from Israel, Palestine, from the United Arab Emirates, and also from Egypt. We are thankful to the Yale World Fellowship Program. Yale has been very cooperative, and we have been able to invite all these speakers thanks to the Yale Fellowship Program, and especially to Anita Sharif, who is not here, but who really helped us in getting the speakers. So I would like to request Mohammed Elfayoumy, Diala Khamra, Sawsan Zaher, and Raheela Khan.
Best way to start the discussion, which is maybe a surprise to our panelists, but I'd like to ask each of them to offer maybe 4 or 5 minutes worth of opening statement on whatever topic you would like that fits in the context of the panel and the overall conference, but it's pretty broad. So even without giving you specific directions, I hope that's a reasonable request so that everybody gets to hear a little bit of your perspective and your interests. So I'd just like to, I will pass this microphone along one by one and ask everybody to speak for 4 or 5 minutes. And then I have some questions that I was given by Mohammed that I can ask openly, and you can decide who would like to answer them. 1 or 2 people, I guess, with each one. And after I've done a few questions, we'll see how our time is going, but then we'll open it to everybody else. So would you please begin?
Yes. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me well? My name is Diala Khamra, and I'm from Jordan. And I'm particularly happy to be here because at this time in the Arab Spring, I find myself having more questions than answers, especially as a female believing in secularism, living in the Middle East at this time. I'm not sure I have many answers. But I'm sure our people will have the answers. I have always believed in the power of people and in the power of community. And in 2008, when I first established the Legal Aid Center, the Justice Center for Legal Aid, my objective was not only to help people solve their legal problems, but to create citizens who have a sense of justice, who feel that they have been treated justly by the system, have been given the due process, were offered the opportunity to be treated equally, regardless of their economic power. This by itself will create people who are more active in their society, who could more actively participate in building their community. They are not consumed with the sense of injustice that they've had, but they are able to become constructive components of the society that they live in. Many of the partners we worked with were community-based organizations, and that's where the power is. And in selecting our partners, we tried to find the organizations that worked on mobilizing the community empowering the community so that community members collectively can manage the affairs of their own small community. And to be honest, that was in 2008, and we did it because we knew that it was important, involving the community. But now when I look back, and at the time that I am right now, I understand how important community mobilization and participation is. And this is how, in my view, the Arab Spring started. A group of people came together, having a sense of injustice, not happy with the regime. They did not have a say in the decision-making process, so that it was easy for them to hold the system accountable for whatever was causing them either economic or social injustice. What happened is that there was consensus on the outcome, but there was no consensus about the process and the outcome after the process. The short-term outcome was we wanted the regimes to go. We got that. And then we were stuck with individuals who did not engage in dialogue and did not agree on how we want to move forward. That was countered also, or in parallel, there is the rise of political Islam. So you have, on one hand, a group of people who haven't got the chance to engage in discourse about how they want to move forward and what do they want to achieve at the end. How will we distribute the social and economic pie? Is it the rule of the majority? Or do we want a rule that fosters diversity? Dean O'Connor, in his opening remarks, he celebrated the diversity and how beautiful it is and how enriching it is, and it really resonated when he said, and we at this point are at a stage where political Islam is on the rise, as my colleague also said. And there isn't one shape or form of political Islam. It comes in many colors. But the essence of political Islam is the rule of the religion. The principles of Islam would rule. And it is the responsibility of Muslims, even if that rule does not prevail, that we fight so that it prevails. So you have these conflicting powers going on. Political Islam having a sense of responsibility of ruling, and the different voices of the people and the citizens that are trying to organize and come together. A third factor that has affected this whole process is the external forces. It is no longer about us trying to reach the we the people moment. It is the external forces that are concerned about preserving their foreign interests, their international interests. So how do we balance all three elements together? How will we get to the moment when we will be able to take over and decide on what we want? Today we're talking with the business people, so when I'm talking about external forces, it could also be economic forces. What is the view of the international community? Do they want to come and invest so that the slice for them is bigger? Is it only employment opportunity for my people? Or they look at us as partners and they will come and work with us as partners to build our economy. These are some of the questions that I have, and I will hand over the microphone to my colleague. And I hope that we will be able to engage in dialogue later on to address these many questions and conflicting ideas that, and emotions that I'm particularly feeling at this time. Thank you.
Hi. So I'm going to represent not just MENA, but the newly analyzed sector by IMF, MENAP, which also includes Afghanistan, Pakistan, in fact. Another two troubled areas. We're all troublemakers, seems like, in the US. Looking at GDP growth rates, you know, ABIC has given a lot of data out, and well, in the last 10 years, from 2003 to 2013, on average, the highest GDP growth rates have lied in the Middle East, including the Gulf Persian, which is most of the Gulf Cooperation Council countries. On an average, we've also seen Jordan, Lebanon, Libya. Libya has had 102% increase, but it's extremely volatile on its GDP growth rates again. Post and pre-Arab Spring crisis, in fact. But on an average, we've seen these countries to be having a GDP growth rate of 6%, 5%. On higher sides, Qatar has been the highest of 13% average. And it really, I'm going to be a more positive outlook to this region than anything else. I still look at it with an economy, you know, which if you look at the Western world, the Asian Pacific region, and the Middle Eastern region, what does the world look like right now? And a lot of things come out. Looking at the US shutdown, $16.8 trillion deficit with a merely 145 billion reserves, and the rainy day check of $114 billion is not a pretty picture. So the world slightly becomes still a better place compared to the US. The Asia Pacific region has had tremendous amount of growth. They're still developing growing economies. Their economies of focus. The larger economies that are looked into with $3.5 trillion of reserves with China and a $1.2 billion rainy day check with China, which basically is also sovereign wealth fund. The GCC countries altogether have a 1.6 trillion, larger than China, sovereign wealth fund, which shows how stable politically and economically the region is within the Middle East, and it has sort of remained politically and economically stable in the sea of unrest. What are the factors that have led this economy, these GCC economies, to be stable, and what are the growth indicators? Well, there are four things really that they've been investing in terms of their economic development. That's human capital, where they've been focusing on education, health, skill building. They've looked into physical capital. They know that they're more vulnerable to oil prices movements, and they need to diversify, and they're also trying to make reserves of hydrocarbon now. The natural capital is that. The physical capital is industrialization, developing the service industry, also developing a much larger open market for entrepreneurs and business society to come in, and opening opportunities of investment and employment in this region. And most importantly, what Diala said as well is social capital, where these economies are now particularly investing into social capital, where it matters what are the people's values, what are their attitudes, how they look at, you know, the culture, what do they think, what is the general attitude like? Is it active, is it passive? What is fair in the economy right now? And they're trying to work on youth engagement, women empowerment, gender imbalances, which is still going to be a question because the gender balance in these countries, especially Qatar, is the worst in terms of its sex ratio in the region. There's only 0.25% of the population which is women. So even 100% of the women who work in Qatar will still remain in terms of gender imbalance. The second worst follows to be UAE, Emirates, and then goes on to China, which is most talked about though. But the gender imbalance is really, but again, looking at these economies to be mostly expat-driven, where 80% of UAE population is expats. There's a large number of women who are now working. 43% of the women are working. High literacy rates in these countries. Jordan is actually the highest in the Middle East in terms of literacy. In terms of women workforce, UAE is at 40% plus, Israel is at 40% plus, Jordan is about 20, Egypt is about 20%. But these regions are relatively growing in terms of women literacies, or also growing in terms of women workforces. So having a much more positive outlook, I think these are lands of opportunity. They're more of interconnective, they're more interconnective economies. There have been especially the GCC countries have been inviting opportunities, have been inviting health, educational development opportunities within the region. And if anything, they're literally creating more interconnections between Asia, Europe, and the rest of the world. So I would give a very positive outlook to the Middle East in going down in the future. And I would like to pass it on to Sawsan from here.
So thank you for inviting us here. I am very happy to be here, and I'm happy that Raheela ended with the interconnection between Asia and the Middle East, because there is this hole right there which is called Israel and Palestine, which actually for me, for us as Palestinians, it kind of actually disconnects the Asia from the MENA region, North Africa and the Middle East. And I am also happy to be here as a Palestinian citizen of Israel, not only as a regular Palestinian from the OPT, to talk about this, about our context within the subject of this conference, because generally, when we are asked to speak about politics, peace process, solution, human rights, how is the future going to be? But as Palestinian citizens of Israel, we kind of find ourselves absent from the more important, let's say, or from the real discourse, which is economic growth, investment, where we are, who we are, relatively to the others, and how the international countries or international economists and investors look at us. And we find ourselves absent, unfortunately, from this discourse. But of course, there are many reasons, because initially we were also absent from any discourse about the peace process or even about the conflict. The voice that I am now bringing on this table is a voice of a Palestinian citizen of Israel, being part of the national and even indigenous minority inside of Israel, who were able, for several or specific reasons, unique reasons, to stay in what became Israel after the war in 1948. Since then until now, we comprise between 18 to 20% of the Israeli population. We have Israeli citizenship, and we are supposed to have equal citizenship, right? Whether political citizenship or cultural citizenship or social and economic citizenship. But unfortunately, the situation is not so flourishing as in the economic picture.
Gulf, yes.
Because since 1948, we have been living in a state that, on the one hand, it's defined itself as a democratic state, but on the other hand, it defines itself, most importantly, as a Jewish state. and thus giving exclusive priority to one ethnicity, which is the Jewish people. I'm not going to get into now all the legitimacy or the justification. I think this is a political question or maybe ideological question, which I might put it. I'm going to put it aside and deal actually with the current situation now. And because again, when everybody talks about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict or even the Middle East, the Palestinian citizens of Israel are really absent from this discourse. So since 1948 and the 1950 actually law of return, which was enacted to give automatic citizenship to any Jew in the world, this actually set the raison d'etre for anything that came later. So this actually set a beginning to what we experienced since then until now, which is getting stronger and stronger, institutionalized discrimination by the State of Israel. Whether it is by discrimination in budget allocation, criteria for budget allocation, which is based on encouraging the Jewish Israeli to come to Israel and get subsidies from the state. Budget allocations have been, and even since 1948 and even until now, been provided based on political perspectives, even if it is not clearly that's the result of many of the budget allocations that have been there. Recently, we are viewing a more right-wing politics, whether in the parliament, in the government, and even in the Israeli Supreme Court, where I mostly appear there. And we are viewing a wave of right-wing discriminatory laws that are targeting the Palestinian citizens of Israel, viewing them as the other, as the enemy, as the threat, having an arbitrary ban, for instance, on family unification between Palestinians of Israel and Palestinians from the West Bank because of their national belonging, viewing all of them as a threat without having any individual check on each of those individuals applying for family unification. So, and so on, and so on, and so on. We talk about like more than 40 discriminatory laws, more than 40 laws that really illustrate and strengthen this raison d'etre of the Jewishness of the state, whether in education, in health, in budget allocation, in you just name it, the Jewish state is over there. So this brings me to another question: where are we in all the discourse? In Oslo process, we weren't there, so Oslo came and Oslo left, and the Palestinian citizens of Israel were absent. And then the second intifada came, the second intifada left, and the Palestinian citizens of Israel were absent, despite a traumatic event that we had in October 2000, where 13 Palestinian citizens of Israel were killed by police officers during peaceful demonstrations, and no officer was convicted or even indicted, despite the responsibility that they were found for the killing of those citizens. And then now the negotiations have returned and seemingly, not successfully achieving anything. And again, the Palestinian citizens of Israel are absent. So what I want to bring to this table is that we cannot look at the Middle East without looking at the situation of the Palestinian citizen of Israel. Mainly also because they are even not being represented in any of the peace talks, neither by Israel because they cannot, nor by the Palestinian Authority because also they cannot. So you have a huge population that is living what we call the ongoing Nakba. We are still living what happened in 1948. We are still living that. We are still feeling that. We are living under Israeli rule, being citizens, but unfortunately treated as a second or even third-class citizens. And we are supposed to be as an important component in this whole peace process. This, of course, would bring me to your topic, which I would be very much happy to talk about, and which is where are we? How can we look economically at in terms of investment and economic growth? Where are we, and how can we really think of investing in this place? And I would leave that for the answers to your questions. Thank you. I'm sorry for taking much time.
Can we save some energy and just turn off the projector? Okay. So, first of all, I would like just to mention that the term Arab Spring is a term that I never favored, and I don't think anybody who protested and who took part in the demonstrations and the revolution that erupted in the Middle East had this term in their minds. The Arab Spring term was actually, it was coined by the Deauville conference in France in March 2011. And this is all the analogies that the Europeans and the Western intellectuals like to draw. So the term itself draws an analogy with what happened actually in the European Spring in 1848. And apparently, every term has its implications. So what happened in 1848 in Europe is actually repeating itself in a different way in the Arab world. So, as Abik said, and as he started saying about the essence of what happened in the Middle East and in our countries, it is individual human aspirations. This is what happened. Everybody is looking for dignity, and Arabs and Muslims are no different, and Muslims and citizens of the Arab world are no different than anybody else in looking for individual dignity. But under this, and here I will be speaking about two countries which I have some experience with, which is my country, which is Egypt, and the other country is Syria, where I lived and worked for almost 5 years. In Egypt, the question of human dignity had underpinnings which were mainly based on socioeconomics and were reflected in the state structure. So socioeconomics meant for the Egyptians, first demographics. We have more than 60% of the population under 30 years old, and a very high unemployment, a problem of urbanism. There is a big gap between countryside and city citizens. Also, there was the question of wealth distribution and wealth production. And then the whole economic paradigm that was prevalent before, starting at least from 1974 under President Sadat, and prevailed under Mubarak and his cronies. On the other hand, in Syria, the human dignity question was different and was much more complicated. The underpinnings of this was not only state structure and socioeconomics. The underpinnings were nation building. Egypt is a different case, is almost a unique case in the Arab world, where we have this kind of state which has been there for almost 5,000 years. A citizen from Alexandria or a citizen from Aswan, almost, which is 900 kilometers or 1,000 kilometers apart, over the past 5,000 years, they belong to the same political entity, more or less. But this was not the case anywhere else, especially in the Mashriq, in the Levant, in Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Palestine, and Iraq. So in Syria, there were geopolitical, nation-building questions. What is the nation? What is the Syrian nation? Why is somebody from Damascus and somebody from Aleppo are under the same government, and how they deal with each other? And why is an Alawite and why is a Sunni are in the same country, and how they deal with each other? So nation building was never complete in Syria. On the other hand, there was the geopolitical question. In Syria, we witnessed all kinds of, over the past 40 years, all kinds of geopolitical influences. Iran, Hezbollah, Turkey, even Israel had a lot of geopolitical influence. So the question of human dignity had the underpinnings of those factors, and then it's not an easy question to answer. This will lead me actually to the prospects. And here I will be very brief. In Egypt, I would say that on the short term, which in my mind, in my argument is from few months to around 3 years, I'm not very optimistic about the Egyptian question. In Egypt, we have problems with the state structure, as I said. This needs to be resolved. The role of the military, the relationship between the society and the state, the role of the bureaucracy, and how to radically transform the bureaucracy in Egypt. And this has all, and also how to shift the economic paradigm. The question of political Islam, although it seems very important, and it seemed very important over the past year, but this is only a question that masks the underlying severe question. So, and I do not really agree with the outlooks that political Islam is on the rise. I would say that from mid-90s, and especially after 9/11, 9/11's political Islam is on decline, and I agree with Olivier Roy in his perspective in this sense. Religion is on the rise in this part of the world, but political Islam is not. And probably we can talk about this more in the question and answer. So in the short term in Egypt, we will have political instability, unsustainable economic paradigm, protests will continue, security problems, governments will change, and this is over the next few months until like 2 or 3 years. But having mentioned that, the underpinnings of the question of human dignity are easier to solve because they are only related to the state, not the nation itself, then I'm very optimistic on the medium and long-term prospects in Egypt. So after, I would say, 5 to 10 years, things will become much better, and Egypt will become more stabilized, and the economy will start moving again. And probably, and this is a wishful thinking, Egypt will restore its role in the region that it was in the 50s and 60s, probably. In Syria, it's different. The short term is very messy. The status quo will still be there over the next 2 or 3 years. Status quo, war that is even getting worse and worse. International community unable to act, and both opposition and regime unable actually to find a common ground. And even inside the regime, it will fragment more as inside the opposition. In the medium term in Syria, and in the whole Levant, probably I see geopolitical changes. I see changes probably in the map itself of the Eastern Mediterranean part of the world. In the long term, I can only use the quote of Keynes, the British economist. In the long term, we are all dead. Then I have here to move to probably something that is of interest to you, which is the US government and foreign policy of the US towards the Middle East. I see confusion, I see hesitation, I see a lack of consistency. And this is not only dangerous for the Arab world, it's more dangerous for the US. The US and the decisions that the US government has been taking over the past 2 years remind me of the decisions and moves that the UK have been taking in the 60s. This, and in a more confused way. And there is no strategic paradigm that we can actually deal with, or we can actually expect what the next step of the US government will be, or what of the US in general will be. The vacuum that was left, that was created by the withdrawal of the UK from the Middle East in the 60s, was filled just by the US. Nowadays, there is nobody to fill this vacuum. I'm not sure that the US is actually very well calculating its interests when it comes to this question. Thank you.
Pass the microphone back here, please. Okay, I'd like to do the following. Mohammed gave me a list of 20 questions to ask our panelists, and asked me to add some more to that, which I did dutifully. And I think that the best way to use our time is to give you an opportunity to interact with the panelists. So at least I will start things off myself, so I don't just act like a bump on a log here. But I will quickly pass the opportunity to you to ask questions and make comments. So here's 2 questions that I'd like to ask, and I'd like maybe each of you to answer one of them, not both. And I'll start with the easier one. This is a business association. I'm president of the Academy of International Business. We're interested in business in the region. The discussion could easily become polemical, as we heard some of our panelists starting to go in that direction. I mean, how can we have a situation where there is not a Palestinian country? I mean, that just seems absurd to me. But I'm not anti-Israel or pro-Palestine. It's just, that's an observation. Or I look at the slide that we saw there for a long time in the earlier presentation showing the different ethnic groups, religious and ethnic groups, And the statement was it's the British or the French fault or the Ottomans' fault for the way that the Middle East is divided. If you tried to segregate according to religious or ethnic group across the countries that were in that map, it's hopeless. There was no division that was obvious to create countries or divisions, political divisions across that region. So I won't get into it. I want to talk about business briefly here, and I have two questions, as I said. Number one, if we look at the companies, let's talk about emerging market multinationals. If we look at companies that are coming out of the Middle East, the only ones that anybody knows about are Saudi Aramco and perhaps other oil companies in the region, oil and energy companies in the region, and maybe the Dubai Port Authority and a real estate company whose name I forget in the United Arab Emirates.
Emar.
So, I mean, we've heard of those, but is there any base for development? Are there any examples of good non-resource companies that are based in the broad Middle East, and what do we see in terms of the future of companies joining the Fortune Global 500 from these countries? And then the second question goes the other way. This is going to be a brief aside. At one point, I was asked to speak about South Africa during apartheid, and the question was, I'm a business professor, what should the role of U.S. business be in South Africa in the mid-1980s at the peak of apartheid, oppression of non-whites? And I've since worked in South Africa for several years, and I have a better appreciation of the situation. But the point is, if I'm an American company manager or if I'm a business professor from America looking at the Middle East, should my response be like what I said about South Africa at that time, which was U.S. business should should operate in South Africa and should try to help bring about improvement in treatment of non-whites during the apartheid regime? And I was absolutely rejected by 70% of the audience, who said there's no role for U.S. business in South Africa. All foreign business should leave to bring down the regime because it is so unacceptable the way the regime operates, and all you're doing as American companies, whether you follow the Sullivan principles or otherwise, you're still supporting an unacceptable regime. So I kind of lost out as a business professor looking at the nice, neatly compartmentalized idea that U.S. business could try to do good and bring about change, peaceful change, let's say. So I didn't work very well, but I'm not sure in the Middle East right now, what should the role of foreign business, say U.S. business, since we have a largely U.S. audience here, be in the region to both do business and perhaps help in the transitions that all of you have been talking about. So could each of you maybe take 2 minutes at most and answer those questions? I guess we can just go down sequentially here.
Well, that's a big question, and that's a difficult question. I wish I had the answer to. I mean, when I was in Jordan, there was this conference for investment to reconstruct Iraq. Where are we today? So while the role of the private sector is important, it is important also to put it in the political and social development context of that country. As my colleague Mohammed said, there isn't one Arab Spring, and the effect the Arab Spring had on the different economies are varied and very different. The situation in Jordan, where we don't have natural resources, is also different than the Gulf countries, which is rich in oil and resources. In Jordan, we had the experience of having IT companies flourish, services companies, companies that build on the local talent of Arab countries as opposed to importing. I mean, the education numbers are important, and for any international investment to be meaningful for us in the Middle East, it would be to work with the local people on building the capacity, transferring knowledge, and creating partnerships. I'm not sure I'm able to answer which sectors are lucrative, which businesses are lucrative, but in terms of the role of international businesses and how I would like to see it contribute to development, it's that of partnership, capacity building, and economic empowerment of the local people.
Thank you.
All right, in terms of your question as to the corporates, I think one industry which Emirates has, or the GCC, I'll stick to GCC because that's where I belong, is aviation. Emirates Airlines, Etihad Airlines, Qatar Airlines, I think very well renowned in the world. There is a huge expansion in terms of investment, so that's an opportunity which lies in still. They're buying more. There's massive airport constructions. There's massive aircrafts that are being bought out. So that's one area which is of opportunity for people who are interested out of US. The other is, again, they want to develop a knowledge and innovation industry. So they've focused on developing the legal infrastructure, and they know that to have the lack of entrepreneurship in the countries is because there wasn't enough legal infrastructure. So the legal infrastructure, the educational institutions are highly coming up now. In fact, that's one region which provides their youth free education within and outside the country. So yes, if all universities want to bring in the Arabs, they're going to be paid by the government. So that's another area where there's huge investments being put in. And again, they're hugely investing into art and culture. And that's, again, in terms of social capital, which was something that I said that they're now focusing a lot more. Obviously, there's economic vulnerability with the whole structure of the imbalance of power that goes on in the region, and they are vulnerable economically, the GCC, with the rest of the Middle East region. But having said that, they're the big supporters of the Middle East region, in fact, and they continue to support those economies. Apik mentioned something earlier, that $120 billion by the Saudi government was spent. That was also out of threat of that unrest within the economies. Qatar had done 60% increase in their salaries, 120% in military salaries, $10 billion for Oman, and so on and so forth. So I'd say, again, financial services, Islamic finance, aviation, education. 3 areas where they're diversifying, 3 areas which are of opportunity.
So after giving my introduction in the first 7 minutes, now let's talk business. You have 2 options. The first option is to join, or at least to be aware of the BDS movement, which is the boycott divestment movement, which is exactly what calls for the economic sanctions and boycott against Israel, whether it's academic, cultural, economic, social, in order as well to put the pressure on Israel because of its continuing occupation and the policy of discrimination against the Arab. This movement is an international movement and is being growing and growing and growing. I'm just posing the 2 options. So if you are aware of that, there is this opportunity. It would depend on your own morals and politics on how to approach this issue in the region in the current times. The other option, and of course you would decide whether to take this option or this option, because there is a boycott law, anti-boycott law that says that I am not allowed to talk about the boycott and then I will be sued. So I'm very careful of that. The second option is to really check whether there are any investment and business opportunities. Now, if I want to bring here the voice again of the Palestinian citizens of Israel, because of the introduction, as a result of the introduction that I gave, we are looking, if we look at the economic growth rate in Israel, we are looking about kind of very reasonable economic rate, while in 2009, which was, in the middle or bit after the economic recession, the economic growth was 1.1%. In 2010, 2011, it rose to 4.6 till 5%. And then it started to drop down mainly as well because of what was happening in the Middle East, mainly what was happening in Egypt and the stop of the gas import from Egypt to Israel, which really affected the economic growth. But one of the main things that is affecting the economic growth is actually the export of products and the services from Israel abroad. Now, relatively, there is a very good export business and economy from Israel abroad, but if we look about what is the rate or what is the share of the Arab citizens of Israel, we see that they are less than 1%, their share is less than 1% of the export of products and services, while the Palestinians comprise 20%, as I have mentioned, among the Israeli populations. This 1% is the share of only 20 Arab companies in Israel, which mainly work on exporting products of food, of natural products like saboons, olive oil, and these kind of thing, and the high-tech company, where in Nazareth, in the Galilee, we are now having emerging a high-tech world. Now, also just to give you another point or another data, also to give you an overview, which we have now almost 700 companies that are in the Israeli stock exchange. 0 are Arab companies. So this just to give you an overview, and of course the decision is yours, because still you are the experts in investment and business.
Okay. I think I can be heard. I think so. So the first question is particularly informative, and I don't have like a concrete answer to this, but there are some names. Like I think you've heard of Kingdom Holding of Walid ibn Talal, Prince Walid. I think everybody here knows or has some business with Prince Walid. And also there is Kharafi, the Kuwaiti Kharafi Holding. Also Diala al-Baraka Holding, which has al-Baraka banks and a lot of investment banks and a lot of food products, and it's present everywhere. This is a multinational company that is, I think, those three, and even the Egyptian Orascom Holding, they are more or less, the owners of them are in the Forbes 500 for richest people on earth. But also, I think the companies themselves have a lot of international presence. Second question is a bit normative question, because I'm not sure that if, as Sawsan just said, if I tell you, okay, the right thing is to invest and partner with the Palestinian citizens of Israel, you will just calculate it. I mean, business is about calculations and about math. For us in Egypt, I would say, according to my analysis and according to the prospects I'm saying, is that you have to invest in probably what is better investment is over the medium and long-term investments rather than short-term. So tourism, particularly not, but maybe real estate is much better. Food and basic commodities is on high demand in Egypt nowadays. Telecommunication is always a good option to invest in Egypt. But what is good actually for the Egyptians themselves is more industry, heavy industry. Industry that is like intense labor industry, something like textile industry, or like steel industry. This is what is good in Egypt, and this investment in industry stopped since 1974, and Egypt has become again a rentier state, which explains a lot of things that happened from the 70s onwards. We need to change the economic paradigm. In Syria, I'm not sure that I can tell you to invest anything, neither on the short term or in the long term, but what I can tell you is that every citizen on earth, I would say, every human being who is witnessing this tragedy going on has to do something at least to the refugees. This is one of the worst humanitarian crises ever in the world history, in the modern history, and actually by the United Nations Human Rights High Commissioner of Refugees. It was classified as the worst humanitarian crisis in the modern history. There is like 2 million refugees and 4 million IDPs, internally displaced persons inside Syria, and overall 10 million, which is 10 out of 20, 50% of the whole population of a country are in desperate need for aid. So probably this is something that you should think of. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so here's what we're going to do with our remaining time. Anybody from the audience, I guess I'll be the one who picks who gets to go first and second, but we have 1 minute maximum to ask your question.
And probably direct it to somebody.
Presentation on the question, so
No, direct it to somebody, please.
No, this is for everybody. Whoever
No,
answers,
no, I
directed on the
mean for
panel,
us.
as in-
I'd like to have one of you answer
Yes.
each question,
They-
only
they-
one. And
they
then
will
we'll go on
choose.
to the next question.
Okay.
Okay, so let's start back there.
My name is Vladimir Padey, and I have a very specific question because what Ms. Zaher mentioned, I'm compelled to respond, but I won't. I'll focus on international business and academic view. So let's take a look at Gaza. When you take a look at Gaza, it was a one-sided withdrawal of Israel from Gaza. The intent was to leave all the villages, the housing, the greenhouses in place. The intent was to provide a way to make a living in Gaza. The intent was to be able to export food to Europe and other countries by leaving the greenhouses in place. What happens after the Israeli withdrawal? The greenhouses got destroyed. The livelihood of the local population, nothing, zip. So where are we going with this? Instead of throwing stones at each other, I want to hear a solution. How are you going to create something that people can get united, that people can come together, that can export stuff? Just boycotting a company in Israel, that's idiotic. You are not mentioning how many Israeli Arabs, and I'll be more specific than you, the ones in the green lines work for Israeli companies. How many people work for Intel that are Arabs? If you are going to start boycotting those companies, you are going to commit harakiri. So let's come back to the issue right now. What's the solution from a business point of view?
Can I respond? Yeah. First of all, I didn't call for boycott. I'm not allowed to call for boycott, even if I think so. I just told you what are the what is on the ground here. So this is it. So returning to Gaza, Gaza is still under occupation. Despite the unilateral disengagement, Gaza was left under occupation. Gaza is still under blockade. Electricity, fuel, water, even bank services between the Gaza banks and the Israeli banks which were supposed to deliver all the taxes and all the social security and all the payments to Gaza stopped. I personally dealt with litigating some of the cases that led to the continuation of transferring the money. So under occupation, people's dignity is being violated. And when you have people's dignity being violated, you cannot talk really about how can they not invest and how can they not grow. People are under occupation. People's dignity are being violated. Regarding what you call the Israeli Arabs, which I'm one of them, but I call myself Palestinian citizen of Israel. So yes, of course, my brother is one of the high-tech persons that work in a Cadence, not even Intel, but I have many friends there, but still the percentage of the Arab Israelis or Palestinian citizens of Israel that work in Israeli companies is very, very low. They face many, many obstacles in getting jobs in the high-tech. I did say that the high-tech companies, among the Arab high-tech company, because they are trying really to emerge in an economic market, and they're really doing their best, especially in an area in Nazareth where they are trying to grow. I would recommend, if someone would decide to invest, to really look at the Arab high-tech companies and not in Intel, because we still can't. We hope we can really get the international companies that are working in Israel to really look on a non-discriminatory, or at least be sure that they will make sure that there will be adequate representation of all the population that is being employed by Intel or Cadence or everyone, which would mean 20% of their employees Arabs, but unfortunately this is not the situation.
No. Okay, let's, boy, go ahead.
Yeah. My name is Benjamin Abudri, and my question is going to Raheela, if I'm right. In your presentation, you appear overly optimistic about the growth opportunities in the region. And my question is, considering the current political and socio-cultural changes which are taking place, and some of the institutional problems the panel has outlined, how can you be optimistic about the economic growth in the region within the short term, as you emphasize? I think the last speaker tended to focus on the medium term to long term, which I agreed mostly with, but I'm wondering why you are so optimistic about the short term.
Well, I didn't really specify short term, medium term, long term, but what I did specify is that this is a big unit within the world. And they're very connected, it's a very well-connected unit, where the GCC does stand vulnerable when it comes to the entire region's security. And obviously, it does work on investing into economic diversification, and it tries to model itself in terms of those diversifications. And the areas of diversification, that's why I pointed out, is human capital, is natural capital, is physical capital, is social capital. And these are things that they're working on, and these are things that will actually work on. When you have a much more diversified economy, you have a likely more stable economy in the region. And there's a huge hand-holding between the Middle East. And that's why when I see this one region, which is the Gulf Persian, to be so strong, I don't see the rest of the region falling apart because they all take one another along.
Okay, we'll have one more question, and it has to be for one of the two people on the end who
question
haven't had a
for
chance to
Mohammed.
respond yet. Okay, go ahead.
My name is Morris Felina. I come from Egypt as well, and I'll be a panelist tomorrow. Actually, I go around in St. Louis and talk about these issues at different universities. So my question is to Dr. Mohammed. And that is, you've said that religion is on the rise in Egypt, but yet political Islam is on the decline. What is the relationship between these two? How do you make the distinction between political Islam and religion? In other words, there's a paradox between these two. They should go hand in hand, but yet they're saying they don't actually go hand in hand. Could you please speak about that a little bit more?
Okay, so the question of religion is, in a way, in the Middle East, is actually connected to the rise of conservatism in the whole world. So we have witnessed the rise of more religion, religious conservatism in the society of Egypt and in most societies in the Middle East, I would say since the 70s, which actually coincided with where we witnessed some kind of religious revival in the US, probably in Israel, in many countries around the world. This means that more sectors of the society identify themselves as being religious, and more sectors in the society identify themselves and actually practice religion, probably dress in a religious way, have some religious connotations to politics and to social values and probably economics. But on the other hand, political Islam, although it coincided and benefited from this, but it was only about certain groups. Political Islam in the sense of having certain groups which are closed, which are practicing politics in the name of Islam. Here, namely, the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood has been on the rise for 90 years, but now, over the past year, they are much on decline in Egypt. And more importantly, since the mid-90s, if we just witness the developments that have happened in the economy, the structure, and the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood since mid-90s, and the rise of this Khairat al-Shatir, who is the actual leader of the Brotherhood, it actually signifies a lot of decline, whether in their ability to attract new followers, their ability to in a way have more preachers and better preachers for their ideologies. So their ability even to spread in other countries. What is going on is that we have more Muslims in the US, more Muslims in France, more Muslims in the UK, more Muslims identifying themselves as Muslims in Egypt, but they are not happy with having a political representation in the government or a group that represents itself as a Muslim in the governments, whether in Egypt or elsewhere. We are seeing now in Tunisia, in Tunisia even, where the Nahda came in power and where they do not have the military actually to oust them, but they are very much pressured and they are pushed to have a lot of reconciliation with what's going with the current political atmosphere in Tunisia. Thank you.
Yeah, excuse me, I was told that we may operate on MENA time instead of North American time. So there's one more person who hasn't received a question yet, and if anybody has a question for Diala back there, she'd like to be able to respond.
Yes, my name is Omar Salgado from Monterrey, Mexico. And I heard Dr. Ross about the ethnic divisions are meaningless for business. However, in my impression, it's very important. What do you think about companies approaching to MENA countries, having in mind what is the division, the difference between one ethnic to the other in the same country and within the same legal framework?
I mean, this topic is very dear to my heart. We have many ethnic groups, religions, and I am seeing the division in our part of the world growing stronger and stronger. Even the constitution in Iraq after the war, it was very sectarian, which reinforced the division between the religions and the quotas. And if I want to appeal to the business community, is to stick to the meritocracy system by instilling principles of meritocracy, hiring those who are qualified, and not looking at the ethnicity issue and dividing the economic benefit according to the social structure of the country. I think this will help us get past this phase of where we talk about ourselves and see ourselves compartmentalized in a sect, in a specific religion, or belonging to a specific group, and engaging us in more dialogue, accepting pluralism, and promoting shared economic benefit of investment and businesses.
Okay, let's have a big round of applause for our